Welcome. Grab your coffee, settle in, and let this story touch your heart. He was just a waiter, black, quiet, invisible to most of the guests. But that night, they didn't just ignore him. They laughed at him, mocked his voice, his skin, his presence. What they didn't know, he was listening, and what he did next silenced the entire room. The clink of crystal glasses and soft murmurs of indulgence echoed through the elegant dining hall of Maison d'Etoile, one of the city's most prestigious restaurants. Velvet curtains swayed gently with the breeze, candlelight flickered on snow-white linens, and laughter floated from table to table. Here, power sat draped in tailored suits and designer gowns. Business moguls, political elites, and socialites whose names carried weight and whispers. In the center of it all stood Jamal, dressed in his crisp black uniform with a pressed apron and polished shoes. Jamal moved silently between the tables. At 28, he'd memorized the rules of invisibility. Speak only when spoken to, always wear a smile, and never, ever show emotion. His hands trembled slightly as he balanced a silver tray holding a bottle of rare 1982 Bordeaux and 4 gleaming glasses. His deep brown eyes darted momentarily toward Table 7, the one he dreaded the most. Table 7 was a circle of excess and entitlement. The guests were regulars. Henry Caldwell, a real estate tycoon with the arrogance of old money. His trophy wife Lorraine, forever clutching a flute of champagne and her own vanity. And their friends, the Lorries, whose presence felt like a live broadcast of smug superiority. As Jamal approached, Henry looked up from his seat, lips already curling. "Well, look who we have," Henry said loudly, causing the entire table to pause their conversation. "The wine magician has arrived. Be careful, Lorraine. He might enchant your glass into something drinkable." Polite laughter followed, but it was laughter coated with venom. Lorraine added with a smirk, "Let's hope he knows his left from right this time." Jamal remained composed. He had learned to harden himself against such cruelty, not by ignoring it, but by enduring it. Every remark was a test, every insult another needle in a growing cushion of pain he had grown used to carrying. He gently poured the wine, labeling each glass perfectly. Henry watched him closely, eyes narrowing. "Tell me, waiter, ever think of doing something else with your life? You know, like actually using your brain?" There it was, the jab, the moment they sought, the one to spark humiliation and solidify dominance. Before Jamal could respond, Henry leaned back with a smug smile. "Oh wait, that's right. You people don't like hard work." The words dropped like lead. The laughter from the table roared, sharp and callous. Jamal's heart thudded. For a second, he considered walking away, just turning and leaving that wretched table behind. But his mother's voice echoed in his head. "Don't let them pull you down, baby. Make them raise their eyes to meet yours one day." So Jamal simply smiled. "Is there anything else I can get for you tonight, sir?" he asked softly. The smirk on Henry's face wavered, just slightly. As Jamal turned away, he caught sight of another waiter, Mia, who looked at him with concern in her eyes. He gave her a small nod, assuring her he was okay. But inside, something was shifting. Not anger, not yet, but something sharper than pain. That night, after the last dessert had been served and the floor had been cleaned, Jamal sat in the empty dining room, staring at the velvet drapes. The manager had gone home, and the others had filtered out one by one. Alone in the silence, Jamal opened a notebook he kept hidden beneath his locker. Inside were sketches, ideas, and numbers, concepts, business plans. He had dreams once, a restaurant of his own, one where no one would ever be judged by the color of their skin. He'd let them laugh, let them sneer, but they didn't know who he really was. They didn't know what he was building. The next few weeks passed much the same. The mocking continued, sometimes subtle, sometimes brutal. A broken glass blamed on him, a complaint about his tone, even suggestions that he wasn't a good fit from influential regulars. Jamal swallowed it all like poison, his silence not weakness but fuel. And then came the moment. On a particularly cold Thursday evening, the restaurant hosted a private gala, an exclusive event for investors and social elites. It was the kind of night that could make or break reputations. The city's top chefs had been invited to present samples from their upcoming ventures. Jamal, as always, was assigned to serve. But as fate would have it, one of the chefs had a sudden emergency and couldn't attend. Panic ensued in the back kitchen. The manager stormed out, berating the kitchen staff. Dishes had already been promised to the guests. Backups were considered, but none could arrive in time. Then Mia, bold and quick, spoke up. Jamal knows how to cook. He's been working on recipes forever. Silence fell. Heads turned. Jamal froze. The manager scoffed. A waiter! But time was running out. In the end, desperation made the decision. They gave him access to the kitchen, but only one shot. One dish. If it failed, it was on him. Jamal didn't waste a second. With calm hands and a focused heart, he began. Ingredients moved like music through his fingers. He remembered flavors his grandmother had taught him, spices his mother had whispered about. He blended soul with technique, heritage with elegance. He called the dish memory on a plate. When the servers brought it out, skeptical murmurs filled the room. But once the first bite touched their lips, silence. Then wonder, and then applause. Even Henry Caldwell looked stunned. "Who made this?" someone asked. The manager hesitated, clearly torn. But then Mia stood beside Jamal and said loudly, "He did." Gasps followed, whispers, and then something Jamal had never expected. Respect. For the first time, they didn't look through him. They looked at him. By the end of the evening, 2 restaurant investors approached Jamal with offers. But he smiled and politely declined, because what they didn't know was that Jamal had already been building something. A new dream, a new space, and their laughter, it had only helped him find the strength to finish it. The air outside Maison d'Etoile was colder than usual as Jamal stepped into the street that night. His fingers, still smelling of rosemary and smoked paprika, trembled in his coat pocket. The clapping, the eyes that followed him, the shift in tone. It all swirled in his mind like a whirlwind that hadn't yet touched ground. He walked home in silence, the sound of his footsteps echoing against damp sidewalks. As the streetlights flickered over cracked pavement, Jamal passed by shuttered shops and quiet stoops, his thoughts louder than the world around him. At the corner of Maple and 8th sat a building with faded bricks and shattered windows, the one he had stared at for nearly 6 years. It was boarded up, forgotten by the city. But to Jamal, it was something else. It was possibility. It was his late-night dream. And now, for the first time, it felt like more than a fantasy. He stood there a long time, just staring. The cold didn't bother him. His eyes saw past the broken windows. He saw tables, chairs, art, laughter, not of mockery, but of joy. People of all kinds gathered, served with respect, united by flavor, not class or color. He whispered to the empty night, "You're next." 2 weeks later, Jamal handed in his resignation at Maison d'Etoile. The manager barely looked up. "Expected this after your little performance," he said, tone indifferent. "Big dreams, huh?" Jamal smiled. "No dreams, just plans." The words settled in the room like dust. Final, undeniable. With the little savings he had, and the small investment offered by one of the guests from that gala, someone who had pulled him aside and said, "You're not just a waiter, you're an architect of flavor." Jamal secured the lease on the building he had walked by 1,000 times. Of course, reality didn't greet him kindly. Renovation costs stacked high, permits were delayed, vendors took advantage. His bank account shriveled. Friends, the few he had, questioned his decisions. Even Mia, loyal Mia, warned him to slow down. "You can't build a palace with just bones and hope," she said gently one night. But Jamal just smiled. Dust in his hair, paint on his shirt. "Maybe not, but I can build a home." He worked days and nights, gutting the place himself, studying every inch of plaster and pipe. He cooked for construction workers, who slowly became his unofficial crew. He bartered meals for help, southern braised lamb for floor tiling, smoked catfish for wiring, cornbread for plumbing. And through it all, he kept a journal, every cost, every mistake, every idea. And a name. He called it Salt and Soul. On the day of the soft opening, the sun rose behind gray clouds like a hesitant blessing. Only a handful of people had been invited, neighbors, old co-workers, and a few brave bloggers intrigued by rumors of a former waiter turning chef. The doors opened quietly. Inside, the restaurant shimmered with subtle beauty. Exposed brick walls lined with art from local black painters. Tables made from salvaged wood, each one etched with quotes of resilience. The lighting was soft, the aroma warm, notes of cinnamon, cloves, garlic, and grilled peach. Mia stood beside him at the host's stand, eyes wide. "You really did it," she whispered. Jamal nodded. "We did." Guests filtered in, and Jamal worked the kitchen like a composer. Graceful, focused. He served dishes like grandma's memory chowder, sweet heat oxtail, and freedom greens with lemon smoke. Every bite carried a story. Every plate was history folded into elegance. Feedback was electric. People left crying, laughing, full. By the end of the week, Salt and Soul had been featured on 3 food blogs, 1 city newsletter, and a viral TikTok clip filmed by a random guest that had already racked up hundreds of thousands of views. But then the past came knocking. 1 week later, on a Saturday night with the restaurant fully booked, Jamal noticed a name on the reservation list that made his stomach twist. Henry Caldwell, table for 4. At first, he thought it was a prank. But at 8:15 sharp, the same man who once ridiculed him for serving wine arrived with a swagger that hadn't dulled. Henry wore a black blazer, his platinum watch gleaming, and beside him were 3 equally pretentious friends, none of whom recognized the man standing behind the reservation desk. "Name's Caldwell," Henry said to Mia. "Private booth if possible." Mia froze for a second. Her eyes flicked to Jamal, who simply nodded. "Take them to the window seat." As Henry sat, he scanned the room and raised an eyebrow. "Place has charm," he muttered. "Little soulful, little rustic. Not bad for a startup." Jamal moved calmly to the table. "Welcome to Salt and Soul," he said, voice steady. "Tonight's menu features both fire and grace." Henry turned, and finally recognition flickered in his eyes. "You," he murmured. Jamal didn't smirk. He didn't flinch. He simply handed over the menus with elegant precision. "I recommend the bourbon-glazed ribeye," he said. "It's bold, unapologetic, and leaves a lasting impression." For a moment, Henry looked uncertain, almost ashamed, but pride kept his mask on. "Well, we'll see if your food's better than your tray balance." Jamal walked away without a word, but in the kitchen his heart raced. Not from fear, not from rage, from the fire of vindication. The food was served. Henry and his guests ate in silence. They devoured every bite, not speaking a word. By the end, Henry pushed the plate forward and stared at it like it had spoken to him. Then he stood and approached Jamal at the counter. "I didn't know," he said quietly. "I didn't see you." Jamal looked up, calm but resolute. "You didn't want to." Henry shifted his weight, eyes lowering. "This place, it's something," he offered. Jamal simply nodded. "So was I, back then." There was nothing left to say. Henry left quietly. That night, Jamal stood outside his restaurant under the same streetlight that once shadowed his dreams. But this time, he didn't feel like a man looking up. He felt like a man who had risen. From laughter, from insult, from invisibility. He hadn't just changed a moment, he had changed everything. Word of Salt and Soul spread like fire through the city's veins. Within 3 weeks, reservations booked 2 months in advance. Food critics praised the blend of heritage and haute cuisine. Local artists and musicians asked to perform or display their work. For many, it was more than just a restaurant. It was a living narrative of struggle, culture, and triumph. But as success bloomed, so did shadows. Jamal noticed them first in the form of silence. Brief pauses in conversations when he entered a room, cold stares from competitors who once mocked his aspirations. Some critics, mostly old-guard culinary elites, began whispering that his success was political, symbolic, even performative. They refused to see the craft behind the creation. To them, his restaurant was a charity case that had gone too far. It didn't stop there. One morning, Jamal arrived early to open and found the front door splashed with red paint. A crude message was smeared across the glass in dripping letters. "You don't belong here." His heart pounded as he stared at the vandalism. Mia arrived moments later and froze. "Who?" she began, but her voice broke off. Jamal didn't answer. Instead, he unlocked the door, stepped inside, and went straight to the sink to scrub his hands. Not because they were dirty, but because he needed the cold water to keep himself from trembling. By noon, the paint had been washed off and a security camera installed, but the message clung to the walls invisibly, echoing in the back of his mind like an old enemy tapping on a window. That night, Jamal hosted a community night event. Discounted meals, open mic poetry, and free meals for families in need. The place buzzed with joy, warmth, and storytelling. For every shadow that loomed outside, there was a fire glowing inside. A man in his early 60s approached Jamal quietly near the end of the evening. His name was Curtis Green, a retired chef who had once helmed kitchens across the South. "You're doing something powerful here, son," Curtis said, voice like gravel and gospel. "But you know this ain't just a restaurant anymore. It's a statement, and statements draw fire." Jamal nodded, emotion tightening his throat. "I didn't ask to be a symbol." Curtis grinned. "Doesn't matter. Symbols are born when people see themselves in your story. You've become more than a man serving food. You're a mirror and a threat." Jamal didn't sleep that night. Days turned into weeks. The restaurant thrived, but the tension simmered beneath the surface. Hateful comments began appearing on their social media pages. One-star reviews from people who'd never visited. An anonymous email accusing Jamal of playing the race card for attention. He read it once and deleted it, but one message in particular haunted him. It was handwritten and mailed without a return address. "Success looks good on you. Shame it won't last. They'll never truly let you win." He didn't tell Mia. He didn't tell anyone. Instead, he worked harder. Jamal began crafting a new menu series called Ancestral Plates, where each dish told a story rooted in African and African-American culinary traditions. Okra dusted in ground chili from Nigeria, smoked duck stew inspired by Gullah cuisine, plantains soaked in cinnamon butter, inspired by his grandmother's Sunday table. He poured his soul into each course. He wanted people to taste history, to feel his roots, and then an unexpected invitation. One evening, a sharply dressed man walked into Salt and Soul without a reservation. He introduced himself as Thomas Blake, executive producer for City Table, the most-watched food documentary series in the country. "We're doing a new feature on underdog chefs reshaping the culinary scene," Thomas explained. "You're not just a story. You're the story." Jamal blinked. "You're serious?" Thomas smiled. "We'd like to shoot an episode here. Follow you for a few days. Capture your process." It was surreal. A show he'd watched for years, one that had never featured a black-owned restaurant, now wanted to spotlight him. Mia was thrilled. Curtis dropped by and slapped Jamal's back with pride. The crew arrived days later, cameras capturing every angle of the kitchen. The prep, the customers, the chaos, the calm. But fame, like flame, burns both ways. On the third day of filming, just before service, the restaurant's lights flickered and went black. Total outage. Jamal rushed outside, heart racing. The power lines were untouched, but the circuit breaker behind the building had been smashed. Deliberately. The security camera had been spray painted. They had been targeted. Again. And this time, it was no paint. It was sabotage. They called the police, but no suspects were found. The officer's tone was professional, but indifferent. "This kind of thing happens," he said. "Could be kids. Could be competition." But Jamal knew better. That night, as he stared at the dark ceiling of his apartment, the weight of it all crushed him. The laughter that haunted him as a waiter, the graffiti, the stares, the threats, the silence from those who pretended to support him but disappeared when things got ugly. He whispered into the dark, "What more do they want to take?" But just before sleep claimed him, he remembered something his mother had once told him after a rough day at school. The louder they laugh at you, the more afraid they are of what you'll become. The next morning, Jamal didn't just fix the breaker. He called a local mural artist. Within days, the side of Salt and Soul was transformed into a breathtaking mural of black chefs from history. Real ones, forgotten by time. Edna Lewis, James Hemings, Leah Chase, and in the center, an empty silhouette with the words, "Still cooking." The press arrived. The community rallied. And on the final night of filming for City Table, Jamal stood before a full house and served a dish he called Vindication. A spiced lamb chop crusted with charcoal salt, served atop mashed red yams with citrus-roasted kale, and a finishing drizzle of smoked pecan gravy. He didn't tell the guests the name of the dish. He just watched them eat. Smiles, eyes closing in delight, whispers of incredible. And when Thomas Blake finally approached him at the end of the night, his voice was hushed, reverent. "You're not a feature, Jamal," he said. "You're a revolution in an apron." But just as the high began to settle, another message came. This one wasn't written. It was spoken. As Jamal was locking up alone one night, a shadow moved across the alley. A man in a black hoodie stepped forward from the dark, just far enough for the light to catch his face. "I remember you," the man said. "Back when you were just a waiter. You should have stayed in your lane." And just like that, he turned and disappeared into the dark. Jamal's hands trembled, because the voice was familiar. He just couldn't place it yet. Rain splattered the sidewalk outside Salt and Soul, each drop smearing the glow of streetlights into pools of flickering orange. Jamal stood behind the locked glass door, eyes scanning the empty street, heart still pounding. He replayed the words in his head. "You should have stayed in your lane." The tone wasn't just threatening. It was familiar, too familiar, like a ghost from a life he'd tried to outgrow. Mia found him the next morning, still in his office, sipping cold coffee and staring into nothing. "You look like you didn't sleep." "I didn't," he said flatly. He told her about the man in the alley, about the voice, about the tension that had slowly wrapped itself around his spine like barbed wire. "We should call the police again," Mia said. Jamal shook his head. "They'll just write another report. I've learned something these past months. Mia, sometimes the law protects a building but not the man who built it." She didn't argue. She just sat beside him, quiet, present, anchoring him in the storm. By the following week, City Table aired Jamal's episode. It exploded online. Within 24 hours, the video had over 3 million views. The comments section was flooded with love, admiration, and ugliness. "Only got famous because he's black. Cry me a river. Race card strikes again. Try succeeding without the pity. Funny how they laugh at you, and now we all have to clap or we're racist." Jamal didn't read past the first 100, but Mia did. And what terrified her wasn't the hate. It was how familiar it all sounded. How so many of the same phrases echoed across platforms, copied, pasted, multiplied like venom. She pulled Jamal aside one night. "There's a pattern to it," she said, showing him screenshots and timestamps. "Some of these accounts are fake. They were created days apart. And look, same phrasing, same grammar." Jamal leaned in, then froze. One username stood out. Caldwell77. Jamal's hands went cold. Henry Caldwell, the man who laughed at him during that gala. The man who mocked him in front of his friends. The man who returned to Salt and Soul, praised the food with gritted teeth, and left with unfinished guilt in his eyes. Was he behind all of it? Was he the man in the alley? The threats? The sabotage? Jamal wasn't sure, but he couldn't ignore the knot forming in his gut. That weekend, Salt and Soul prepared for one of its biggest events yet, the Heritage Supper, a collaborative dinner featuring 3 black chefs from across the country, each bringing a generational recipe to honor their roots. Tickets sold out in hours. The night shimmered with anticipation. Photographers, press, guests dressed in elegance. Jazz spilled from the speakers. The air was rich with the scent of grilled spices, roasted peaches, sweet corn. But Jamal's mind wasn't on the food. He watched every face that walked through the door, every coat, every glance. And then, at 7:48 p.m., Henry Caldwell entered. He wasn't on the list. He wasn't invited. But he smiled like he belonged. "Evening," Henry said smoothly to Mia. "Thought I'd stop by. Big night, right?" Mia's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Reservations only." Henry looked past her, right at Jamal. "I'm sure the owner wouldn't mind." Jamal stepped forward slowly. "Let him in," he said, voice calm. Mia flinched. "Are you sure? I need to see something." They seated him at a corner table, isolated from the main flow of the room. Jamal cooked, not because he wanted to, but because it was the only way to focus, to keep his hands from shaking, to hold power in the only language he trusted, food. He plated Henry's dish himself. Braised short ribs, saffron grits, black garlic collard greens. A meal rooted in love, loss, and legacy. He set it in front of Henry without a word. Henry looked up, eyes amused. "Still in the kitchen, huh?" Jamal leaned down. "And yet somehow still higher than you'll ever be." There was no anger in his voice, just truth. Henry's smirk faded. Later that night, after the guests had gone and applause had faded into echoes, Jamal stepped out the back door alone. The alley was quiet, damp, breathing. Then a voice again, this time from the shadows. "You think you're safe now, don't you?" It wasn't Henry. It was someone else. A figure stepped into the pale yellow light of the dumpster lamp. It was Reggie, a former line cook from Maison d'Etoile, a man Jamal hadn't thought about in nearly a year. "You," Jamal said, stunned. "You disappeared after that night, when I cooked at the gala." Reggie's eyes were glassy, angry. "Yeah, because you embarrassed us, made us all look small, like we were nothing." "I didn't make you look small," Jamal said quietly. "You chose to stay small." Reggie stepped closer, fists clenched. "You think they really respect you? These rich folks? You're just the story of the month, the pity project, the polished prop." Jamal's breath caught, but not out of fear, out of grief, because for all Reggie's hatred, there was pain in his voice. Not jealousy, not ego, just a man broken by the belief that the world would never allow someone like him to rise. "I used to believe that too," Jamal whispered, "that no matter how good we were, they'd never let us win. And now I don't wait for permission." Reggie's expression faltered. "I don't need their seat at the table," Jamal continued. "I built my own table, and people are coming, every kind of person. Not because of guilt, not because of pity, but because the food is good, because the work is real, and because I never stopped." For a long time, Reggie said nothing. Then he turned and walked away, disappearing back into the dark. This time, Jamal didn't feel afraid. He felt lighter. 2 days later, a letter arrived in the mail. Handwritten. No signature. "You're making noise, and you're not alone. Keep feeding the hungry. Keep showing them we belong. Keep cooking. We're watching, and we're proud." Inside the envelope was a newspaper clipping from 1963. A story about Edna Lewis, one of the first black women to rise as a renowned Southern chef in America. Jamal held the paper like a relic, like proof, not that he could succeed, but that he wasn't the first, and wouldn't be the last. The next night, Jamal gave a small speech to his team before service. "I know some of you have heard the rumors, seen the messages, felt the tension, but let me be clear, what we're building here is bigger than fear. This place, this kitchen, it's sacred, and no matter what they throw at us, we cook." The staff clapped. Mia placed a hand on his shoulder. "You've changed everything," she whispered. "No," Jamal said. "We did." A soft wind stirred the city's night air as Jamal stood outside Salt and Soul, arms crossed, eyes lifted toward the mural. The colors, once fresh paint, had now set deep into the brick, like memory carved into time. The restaurant no longer needed validation. Its story had become part of the city's rhythm, one of resistance, rebirth, and resilience. But Jamal knew the journey wasn't over, because the laughter that had once mocked him had only evolved. Subtler, softer, hidden behind forced smiles and empty praise. They weren't laughing anymore. Now they were watching. 2 months later, an email landed in Jamal's inbox with a subject line that made his heart skip. Invitation to the Gastronomique Society Awards. It was the most prestigious culinary event in the country. Historically exclusive, historically white. He read the message again, unsure if it was a prank, but it was real. Jamal had been nominated for Chef of the Year. For a moment, he didn't know how to react. The man who once carried trays for arrogant diners at this very event was now being invited to stand among them, as a peer. When he told Mia, her face lit up. "You've made it," she whispered. "No," he replied, quieter. "We broke through." On the night of the ceremony, Jamal wore a deep navy tux with a crimson pocket square, the colors of his grandmother's church robe. Mia wore gold earrings shaped like small cooking pots. Everything about them, together, was a reminder of where they came from. The ballroom was grand. Crystal chandeliers, marble floors, cold champagne and warmer judgment. Some guests smiled too wide. Others offered clipped nods. A few didn't acknowledge him at all. But when Jamal walked to his table, he wasn't alone. Chef Curtis was there. 2 of the guest chefs from the Heritage Supper were there. A young black pastry chef he had mentored sat beside him, eyes wide with pride. Their table was the most alive in the room. Then the moment arrived. A presenter stepped onto the stage and unfolded the announcement card. This year's Chef of the Year goes to a man who reminds us that the kitchen is not just a place of food, but a place of truth. A man who dared to turn laughter into legacy. Pause. Jamal Carter of Salt and Soul. Thunderous applause. Some polite, some reluctant, some absolutely roaring. Jamal rose slowly, breath shallow. Every step toward the stage feeling like he was walking over the ghost of every doubt ever thrown at him. He stood at the microphone, paused, then spoke. "I was once a waiter at this event. I remember the laughter, the condescension. I remember being invisible unless I was serving wine." Soft murmurs rippled across the room. "But that same night I listened to your words, your mockery, your ignorance, and I made a choice, not to get revenge, but to get better, to become so good that even the ones who laughed would have to watch me win." He looked out at the crowd, not angry, just honest. "I didn't build Salt and Soul to make a point. I built it because we deserved a place at the table, not as tokens, not as trends, but as architects of flavor, as curators of culture." He held the award high. "This isn't mine alone. It belongs to every black chef who cooked in the shadows, to every waiter who was smarter than the customers they served, to every young cook told to tone it down. This," he paused, voice catching, "is for those who fed the world and got scraps in return." Silence. Then a slow rise of claps. Then standing applause. Real. Earned. After the ceremony, Henry Caldwell approached, his once arrogant posture now tempered. "You really did it," he said, almost like an apology. Jamal met his eyes. "I didn't do it despite you. I did it because of you." Henry opened his mouth to respond, then closed it. He extended his hand. Jamal didn't shake it. Instead, he nodded once, turned, and walked back to the people who had truly seen him. A year later, Salt and Soul had expanded. A second location opened in Atlanta. A scholarship fund in Jamal's name helped send underrepresented culinary students to top schools. Curtis now taught cooking classes in the community room. Mia handled PR for a growing list of black-owned eateries. And Jamal? He was still in the kitchen most nights. Apron on, sleeves rolled, hands steady. Because success hadn't taken him out of the fire. It had forged him in it. One night, after the dinner rush, a young man approached him nervously by the counter. "You're Jamal, right? The chef?" "I am," Jamal said. "I was a server once, just like you." People laughed, called me names, said I'd never matter. But then I saw your episode on City Table, and I realized maybe I could matter too. Jamal smiled, handed him a plate of cornbread warm from the oven. Pull up a chair, he said. Let's talk about where you want to go. As they sat, Jamal glanced at the mural again through the window. That once empty silhouette in the middle, now filled with his likeness. But room was left for more, because the table he built wasn't just for him. It was for every dreamer who ever served with dignity and swallowed their pride. It was for those still waiting in the kitchen, wondering if their turn would ever come. It was proof that even when the world laughs at you, you can feed them your greatness and change everything. They laughed at him when he was just a waiter, but he didn't fight back with words. He fought back with excellence. And when the time came, he didn't just rise. He brought others with him. Because real success isn't loud. It's undeniable. The waiter who changed everything.